Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, January 12th, 2022, and today I'm going to be talking about whether or not the Democratic Party has a viable chance at the governor's office in the state of Oklahoma. Now, at immediate reaction, many people would be saying no, knowing the state of Oklahoma's very Republican history and its most recent landslide victory for President Trump in the 2020 election, where he won the state by over 30 percentage points over then Vice President Biden. People would say that this race is absolutely not winnable, especially in 2022. But I would counter that by saying that the Democratic Party, surprisingly enough, has a strong candidate to run on their side. And we're going to talk about the electability and the possibility for this Democrat in 2022. Now, who's running? Well, Joy Hofmeister, the current state superintendent, previously a long-term Republican, has been a Republican her entire life, switching political parties, announcing that she is switching because she no longer identifies with Governor Kevin Stitt's Republican Party. He was first elected back in 2018. I actually covered his race and talked about it in a brief period during some time on my channel, and his race was actually surprisingly competitive. Now, the thing about this party switch is that she now serves as the sole Democratic official on the state of Oklahoma's executive team. Looking at every single position besides the nonpartisan ones, Republicans have absolutely obliterated the Democrats in every single position. You have the corporation commissioners, all three of which are Republicans. You have three different commissioners of agriculture, insurance, and labor, one nonpartisan, and two of which are Republicans. Both the governor and the lieutenant governor and the chief of staff and attorney general are Republicans, and looking at the state auditor and the Secretary of State and Treasurer, there you have the Republican. Now, Joy Hofmeister, again, was initially elected as a Republican. If you take a look back at her election history, you will find that in 2018, she ran as a Republican against a Democrat. She was not some type of rhino, as we had been seeing this used in a standard name. I mean, she was the incumbent and she was liked. People really didn't push against Joy Hofmeister. And looking at the margin of victory, she actually outran Governor Kevin Stitt, or at the time was just a candidate at that point, but he was running, succeeding Mary Fallin on this ballot here, in which she outran him by a pretty considerable amount. And if you take a look at the Republican primary, she won with 57% of the vote. When she was elected in 2014, she also won that primary election. Surprisingly enough, the margins were actually very similar in the primary election, and in the general election, Joy Hofmeister actually only won by a margin of about 11 percentage points. Now, keep in mind that was 2014, a red wave year, but at the end of the day, she was still able to win the state superintendent race and held it through today. And she currently serves as in this position, and the election actually is going to be up in 2022. Now, the thing about this party switch is that she actually has taken a much more centrist position. She says that she is a moderate, and she is going to hold a centrist policy position on abortion rights, taxation, and teaching about race in schools. Looking at her campaign video, I am honestly impressed by the way that she has turned this into a non-democratic issue. I think that one thing that many red state Democrats fail to do is actually separate themselves from the National Democratic Party. And I think that looking at her candidacy, she definitely serves to be in a different position than what we've seen for other candidates of Democrats in red states that are in positions where they are trying to vie for a red state governorship, where in most cases they end up failing because the race either gets nationalized or they're too closely associated with the modern Democratic Party. Democrats like Biden and Clinton and Obama and Kerry and Bush were all rejected from the state of Oklahoma for a reason, and that's why very few Democrats are successful in this state, but it has happened in the 21st century. Will it happen this time? We don't know. And probably not, if we're being completely honest about it. And looking at the Democratic primary, this is actually the first step for Joy Hofmeister. She's actually running against the former candidate for Senate in 2014 and governor in 2018. And she actually was not the nominee. In 2018, she ran and lost in that nomination process, but was the nominee back in 2014. Now, looking at the candidate list here, it seems as if these are going to be the only two people that are running against each other. And honestly, Joy Hofmeister has more name recognition and has more of a backing to her candidacy. In 2014, Connie Johnson ended up losing the Senate election by a pretty considerable amount and could not even win a singular county. In fact, couldn't even crack 30% when candidates like Biden were able to in a presidential election, a year that should be much more partisan compared to some individual Senate elections, but that clearly was not the case in 2014. But with Joy Hofmeister on the ballot, what this does is now have two executive positions running against each other. You have the incumbent governor, of course, on the ballot on the Republican side. You are not going to see any type of pushback against the incumbent governor. And looking at the Democrats here, once Joy Hofmeister, I think, will win this primary, I think once she actually gets there, you will have the state superintendent against the incumbent governor. Now, the interesting thing is that polling data doesn't suggest that Hofmeister has a realistic shot. All of the polls seem to indicate that Kevin Stitt has a 15-point plus lead over Joy Hofmeister, and the ratings here put them in solid Republican. So already you know that Republicans have the advantage and are very much expected to win this race. But things could end up changing. And I'm not saying this as a means of trying to say Joy Hofmeister could actually win this race, but I do think that it could narrow down, as we have seen in 2018, 2014, and even 2010. I want you to take a look at the presidential margins of victory for Republicans in Oklahoma, just to provide a bit of context before we get into these midterm election results. Because looking at the 2018 race, I mean, this race was obviously going to be won by a Republican. But when you take a look at what the numbers had said, let's see what the ratings were. I mean, some of them actually had it as a toss-up. Some have them at lean R and likely R, and I think a lot of it had to do with the national year and also the fact that Drew Edmondson actually had a lead over Kevin Stitt, but Kevin Stitt ended up winning across the state, and that actually wasn't quite surprising. I mean, it was yes, a Democratic wave year, but it is still Oklahoma nonetheless, and you'll see this very clearly why Republicans do well based off of the elections, but Democrats fielded a strong candidate in 2018, and in terms of electability, I don't think that we are going to see Joy Hofmeister end up winning the race, but she definitely could narrow it down from this solid R that we are expecting it to be. Now, again, take a look at the state of Oklahoma as we go through the years. Trump wins it by 33 points in 2020. In 2016, he actually won it by 36 points. In 2012, Romney won it by 34 points. In 2008, McCain won it by 31 points. In 2004, Bush won it by 31. In 2000, it was won by 22. This was actually one of the best performances for Democrats in the state of Oklahoma. In 1996, it actually was close. In 1992, it was also close. In 1988, of course, it was solid, but, it only more recently had started to get increasingly more Republican after the 2004 year, and it has stuck that way ever since. It has always been a 30-point margin. Even in 2008, when Democrats were able to do well across the country, Oklahoma simply did not want to budge. It was John McCain's largest margin of victory across the nation. Surprising that Wyoming was not. Actually, maybe Wyoming was. Maybe it was just the county map there, the only state that John McCain was able to win every single county in. But taking a look at the Oklahoma gubernatorial election here, the Democratic Party actually does have a strong candidate. I really don't think that is deniable. You have the state superintendent who outran the former governor in outran the incumbent governor in 2018 in a Democratic wave year. And I bring up 2018 to show you that Oklahoma has had a competitive race. I mean, we already saw that the race was decided by a margin of 12 percentage points, and at most, the characterization was likely R, and it went all the way down to toss-up. And seeing Kevin Stitt defeat Drew Edmondson by just 12 percentage points across Oklahoma, the same state that 2 years later voted for Donald Trump over Joe Biden by over 30 percentage points, means there are Republicans across this state that were fine electing a Democrat as governor, which means that could be some type of possibility in 2022, especially someone that they had voted for on this same exact ballot that they voted for Kevin Stitt on. And taking a look at the solid red across the state with few blue pockets shows that there is still a significant amount of support for Democrats in larger population areas that drives up their amount of support in some of these states. And I think that is something that definitely needs to be taken a look at, especially for the circumstance that we are working in right now. Governor elections are very different than the national elections, and I do think that Joy Hofmeister, being a previous Republican, actually helps her case in this position. Now, seeing Oklahoma competitive in 2018, you could argue, okay, it was a Democratic wave year, this doesn't mean anything. But 2014 actually shows you a very similar result. In 2014, the Democratic Party came with 41% of the vote by the end of the election. Mary Fallin, remind yourself she was the incumbent at this time, won the race with just 56% of the vote. Keep in mind that Mitt Romney had just won the state by over 30 points, and Donald Trump did 2 years later, yet the margin of victory was less than 15 percentage points. And seeing the race narrow down to where it was in 2014, despite the national environment being so heavily lopsided in favor of the GOP, questions whether or not Mary Fallin, number one, was a super electable candidate, and number two, whether or not Oklahoma, again, is going to listen to the national environment for this governor's race. Because one thing that we actually start to see is that the national environment does not dictate governor elections as often or as much as it does in congressional elections. People don't want to say, we are electing in Maryland, for instance, a Republican governor to push back against a Democratic president. There have been very few instances where that has happened, and that 2014 case might be enough, but it didn't happen in 2010, and it isn't always the case. Sometimes it takes, these individual candidates, but I really think that, midterm years and national environments are much less impactful on governor elections, simply because governor elections don't really have any type of significant national implication beyond maybe some laws that could be contested by the Supreme Court or some type of precedent. But other than that, you really rarely ever see these used as avenues to push back on the incumbent president. And 2018 and 2014 are good examples of that. 2018, for instance, you can see that Democrats were losing Massachusetts, losing Vermont, losing New Hampshire, 3 states that they were able to do very well in these exact Senate elections in 2018 and 2020, and did well in 2016. But Republicans were able to win in the governorships by exceptionally large margins. This doesn't mean that these states weren't going to be pushing back on the incumbent president in another way. In this case, it was Donald Trump, just that the governor election really wasn't their avenue to do this. And the same thing could happen in Oklahoma in 2022. And looking at 2010, another year where we had a red wave, Mary Fallin, as running in an open race, only defeated her Democratic opponent by a margin of 21 percentage points. While that margin doesn't seem like it's small, and it isn't small, a 21-point victory is something that people can celebrate, it isn't outperforming or even on pace with where Republicans are on the presidential level. Again, let me remind you of where we were at that point in time. Oklahoma had just voted for McCain by 31 and then voted for Romney by 34. Yet in this election, Mary Fallin was only able to win by 21 percentage points. And seeing that reduction, and again, 2010 was a red wave year. Republicans picked up 63 seats in the House of Representatives, picked up numerous Senate election seats. Mary Fallin only won by 20. And that's the thing. The bar is set so much higher for Republicans in Oklahoma, and seeing them underperform actually suggests that there is not a significant amount of support for Republicans as there is on the presidential level in these governor elections. Yes, they are winning by large margins, but that means there are voters out there that were fine with Bush twice, fine with McCain, that wanted a Democrat for governor in 2010, and then wanted another one in 2014, and then wanted another one in 2018, despite voting Republican likely, potentially actually, their entire lives, or at least for the entirety of the 21st century presidential election results. And seeing Joy Hofmeister in this position, and a powerful one, I would say she does have a stake against Kevin Stitt and could end up narrowing down this race. In terms of electability, no, I do not think she is going to win this race. The state of Oklahoma is too red for a blue candidate at this point in time. But in terms of making a race competitive, in terms of focusing resources from the GOP and Democrats into this race, and potentially building the groundwork to potentially win a House race in the next 8 to 10 years before the map is switched up yet again, I think that might be a possibility. But seeing Joy Hofmeister as the more than likely Democratic nominee for governor, I think that the Republican Party might be in a position where Oklahoma is no longer considered safe. Because as 2018 has shown, you can see here it has been competitive. As 2014, 2010, red wave, blue wave, it doesn't matter. Oklahoma's governor elections typically are competitive. And they find themselves in a position where they really don't end up going too much in favor of the GOP as much as they had like. I think that seeing the presidential margins, I'm honestly not super impressed by the GOP's victories in these governor races. But at the end of the day, a victory is a victory. So Republicans are going to win this race. I think that is a fair estimation at this point in time, but Democrats definitely have a top-tier candidate in this race. And if they do end up spending more money and they do end up narrowing down this race, it will force Republicans to allocate at least some resources to the state of Oklahoma that they otherwise would not have if Connie Johnson was the nominee. There is a big thing to say, you are a previous Republican now running as a Democrat, and you are running on the issue of education. The Republican Party is going to try to nationalize the issue of education in 2022 because it worked in the state of Virginia and it partially worked in the state of New Jersey. And I think that's something that they are going to see as a blueprint, and Joy Hofmeister has more of a say in that than anybody else. Serving as the state superintendent and outrunning the current governor back in 2018, she does have some type of electability to her name. The only unfortunate reality for her is that while she may be a candidate that might be able to capture a lot of support, she still has the D by her name, and that will be enough to prevent her from winning this governor's race altogether. A party switch of this nature is important to note because she now serves as the only statewide elected official that is a Democrat, but She was not elected as a Democrat, and had she ran as a Democrat in 2014 or even 2018, I have no doubt in my mind that she would have lost this race and that she would have fallen off into political relevancy. And that might be a harsh situation and a harsh reality for many of these candidates, but in many states like Oklahoma, that D by your name is enough to sink any ticket in the general election. So we will reevaluate in a few months from now. Maybe Oklahoma will change a bit. We will see if the map ends up getting worse for Kevin Stitt, or if it ends up being maybe worse for Joy Hofmeister. I think that things definitely are in a position where if Joe Biden ends up becoming more and more unpopular, that things get better for the GOP, and this is just a lost thought. But of course, things can change very rapidly in American politics, and things can change pretty dramatically in just a short period of time. So we will check up on it in a few months from now. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.